السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أنا فخور وفرحان جدا بوجودي هنا كرئيس الوفد الإسرائيلي.
Just a very important event, and it's an honor to have you with us, baby. Thank you very much.
I thank you both for your wise leadership and for working with the United States and Israel to expand the circle of peace.
Prime Minister of the State of Israel, thank you for choosing peace.
This was the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country in over a quarter of a century.
Welcome, Erev Tov, Masa El Khair. On behalf of the Shilah Forum, the Kohelet Forum, and the Israeli-היום newspaper, I'm pleased to welcome listeners here in Israel, in the Emirates, Bahrain, and other Arab countries, in the United States, and in countries across the globe. We've all seen several spectacularly failed attempts to forge a new and better Middle East. The question on our minds today is therefore, will this time be for real? Are the Abraham Accords indeed the harbinger of an era of peace and prosperity in the region? To answer this question, we'll hear from experts in the Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and of course Israel and the United States. We're especially honored by the participation of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, American Ambassador to Israel David Friedman, and President Trump's Special Envoy Avi Berkowitz. The first part of the event will be broadcast today and includes an address by Prime Minister Netanyahu, an interview of Ambassador Friedman with Boaz Bismuth, and an international expert panel on Israel's standing in the Middle East in light of the Abraham Accords. The second part, to be broadcast at the same hour tomorrow, will include an interview with Special Envoy Avi Berkowitz, two expert panels, one on the Trump vision and its consequences for the Middle East, and another on the prospects for economic cooperation as a new paradigm for coexistence in the region, as well as a brief lecture on plans for a binational free trade zone in the Jordan Valley. Please note that the entire program will be available in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. This has not been a simple production, and I'm pleased to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Anat Roth, Director of the Shilah Forum, for organizing it all. We hope you'll find the program both interesting and edifying. It's now my great honor to invite the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, to open the conference.
שלום לכם אנשי קהלת, שילה וישראל היום. אני שמח להופיע בפניכם נוכח כינון הסכמי השלום ההיסטוריים עם איחוד האמירויות ועם בחריין. הבאנו שלום אמיתי, שלום חם, שלום תמורת שלום, כלכלה תמורת כלכלה. את הפירות של הסכם השלום הזה כולם רואים כבר עכשיו. השבוע עגנה בנמל חיפה אוניית הסחר הראשונה שהגיעה מדובאי. יש לנו נתיב סחר חדש בין ישראל לאיחוד האמירויות. זה יביא לאזרחי ישראל מוצרים טובים יותר וגם זולים יותר. אני חייב להגיד לכם, זה לא רק בסחר, זה גם בנתיבי התעופה. השמיים פתוחים מעל סעודיה, מעל ירדן, מטוסים ישראלים, כל המטוסים, טסים הלוך וחזור אל ישראל ומחוץ לה, מזרחה, לאסיה, להודו, וכמובן למדינות המפרץ. זה שינוי עצום. חברת האנרגיה הגדולה או השנייה בגודלה בעולם, שברון, נכנסה לישראל לא במקרה, היא רואה את השינוי שמתחולל כאן. היא תעזור לנו להוציא את הגז מהמים וזה יביא עשרות ואולי מאות מיליארדי שקלים לקופת המדינה, לכם, אזרחי ישראל. בסוף השבוע האחרון שוחחתי עם ידידי, נסיך הכתר של איחוד האמירויות, השייח מוחמד בן זאיד. סיכמנו על ביקורים הדדיים, על המשך שיתוף הפעולה ההדוק בין הממשלות שלנו. אנחנו דיברנו על שיתופי הפעולה שאנחנו מקדמים בהשקעות, בתיירות, באנרגיה, בטכנולוגיה, בתחומים נוספים, גם במאבק נגד מגפת הקורונה. יש לנו הרבה מה לקדם ומה להביא לכם, אזרחי ישראל, גם בתחום הבריאות. איחוד האמירויות מתכוונת להביא השקעות ענק בישראל. מדובר במאות מיליוני שקלים שיושקעו בכלכלה שלנו, ואזרחי ישראל ייהנו מהפירות. זה כבר קורה, זה יקרה ביתר שאת. זה חשוב תמיד, אבל בייחוד בתקופת הקורונה. כשאנחנו זקוקים לכסף, על מנת שנוכל להמשיך ולסייע לאזרחים ולחזק את הכלכלה שלנו. אני האמנתי בשלום הזה כל חיי הבוגרים. זו הייתה תקווה שהתגשמה. לפני 25 שנים כתבתי בספרי מקום תחת השמש. אני רוצה להקריא לכם, או לקרוא לכם בעברית נכונה. קיימת אפשרות של שלום שאינו כרוך בוויתורים מסוכנים מצידה של ישראל. שלום שנשען על הרתעה ישראלית מתמדת, המבוססת על חיזוק גובר והולך של עוצמתה. אם בדור הבא יגיעו הערבים לכלל הכרה שישראל שוכנת לבטח במזרח התיכון ושהיא עתידה להישאר בו לעד, ייתכן שיתחולל מהפך פסיכולוגי בעמדתם לגבי זכות קיומה של ישראל. אני מאמין שלא לנצח יתיחו מדינות ערב את ראשם בקיר. תפיסה זו, כתבתי, מנוגדת בתכלית לתפיסה אחרת הרווחת היום, הגורסת שישראל תשיג שלום רק אם תפייס את הערבים בוויתורים מרחיקי לכת שיחלישו אותה ויצמצמו אותה. אדרבה, כתבתי, שלום בר קיימא יושג רק אם משכנע העם היהודי את הערבים שעימם ובצדם הוא חייב להתקיים, שכאן הוא נמצא וכאן הוא יישאר. סוף ציטוט. אבל לא רק כתבתי ולא רק נאמתי, גם פעלתי. פעלתי בהתמדה ובנחישות במשך שנים להשיג את היעד הזה. מדינות ערב חברו לישראל כתוצאה משני גורמים מרכזיים. העמידה האיתנה שלנו, שאני הובלתי, מול איראן, ולפעמים הייתי צריך להוביל את זה לבד, לא רק מול מדינות העולם, אלא גם מול לא מעטים בממסד הישראלי. והדבר השני, בנוסף לעמידתנו מול איראן, טיפוח העוצמה של ישראל, העוצמה הצבאית, הכלכלית, הטכנולוגית והמדינית. אני מבקש להודות כאן לנשיא טראמפ וצוותו על תרומתם החשובה להשגת ההסכמים ההיסטוריים האלה. אבל בעניין של איראן, זה לא היה קל, ולא תמיד הממשל האמריקני ראה איתנו עין בעין. אני נאמתי בקונגרס האמריקני ודרשתי לבטל את הסכם הגרעין המסוכן עם איראן. את הנאום הזה ראו לא רק כאן, אצלנו, ולא רק בארצות הברית, ראו אותו גם, והייתי אומר אפילו בעיקר, במדינות ערב. הם ראו איך ישראל לוחמת באומץ נגד אויב מסוכן שמשליט טרור בכל האזור. הם ראו איך ראש ממשלת ישראל נוקט באותה גישה שבה גם הם דוגלים, אם כי הם לא תמיד מתבטאים כך. אחרי הנאום הזה קיבלתי מסרים רבים ממנהיגים באזור. הם חיזקו אותי, תמכו בעמדתנו וביקשו להדק את היחסים עם ישראל. זאת האמת במזרח התיכון. אני חושב שזאת האמת בעולם כולו. בעולם ובאזורנו מעריכים את החזק, לא את החלש. ושלום עושים עם החזק. אף אחד לא רוצה לחבור לחלשים. שלום עושים עם מי שנחוש להילחם כדי להדוף ולהביס את האסלאם הקיצוני, לא עם מי שמתרפס בפניו. היו מי שאמרו שכדי להשיג שלום, יש לסגת לגבולות שאינם בני הגנה, להפקיד את הביטחון שלנו בידי אחרים, לעקור עשרות אלפי מתיישבים, אם לא למעלה מזה. מעצמות העולם אמרו לנו, הוויתורים שלכם יביאו לשלום, והשלום הוא שיביא לביטחון. תוכנית מסוכנת זו, לו יצאה אל הפועל, הייתה הופכת את ישראל לפגיעה, לחלשה, חלשה ביטחונית, כלכלית, מדינית. והשלום לא היה מחזיק מעמד, לא הרבה זמן, אם בכלל. אני טענתי מזה עשורים את ההפך הגמור, שהחפץ בשלום חייב קודם כל להיות חזק, ולכן פעלתי במגוון תפקידיי, גם כשר האוצר וגם כראש ממשלה, להפוך את ישראל למדינה מאוד חזקה. כשר אוצר וכראש ממשלה פעלתי לשחרר את ישראל מכבלי הכלכלה ההסתדרותית הריכוזית. קידמתי עשרות רפורמות שהביאו למהפכה של שוק חופשי, יזמות ושגשוג. אני מאוד מעריך את העובדה שמישהו שאני מאוד 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 מעריך אותו וקראתי רבים מספריו, מילטון פרידמן, אמר כשהייתי שר אוצר, סוף סוף יש בישראל שר אוצר שמאמין ומקדם מדיניות של שוק חופשי. נכון מאוד. עשינו עשרות רפורמות מול שביתות של ההסתדרות, מול השתקת המדינה, מול ביקורת נוקבת שהסבירו איך אני ארוס את הכלכלה. אבל בזכות השינויים הללו, ודברים קודמים שעשיתי, כגון שחרור המטבע שלנו, שהם יכולים לצאת עם יותר מאשר חופן דולרים, שאתם צריכים לקבל אישור עליהם בבנק ישראל מאיזה פקיד, כל זה סילקנו, שינינו את זה. ובכן, בזכות השינויים הללו, אנחנו מממשים את הפוטנציאל המדעי, הטכנולוגי והיזמי, את הגאונות שיש בעמנו ובאזרחינו. הכפלנו ושילשנו את התוצר. רק כלכלה חזקה יכולה לספק את המשאבים לפיתוח צבא חזק ומודרני שיספק לנו ביטחון. ורק שילוב של העוצמה הכלכלית והעוצמה הצבאית מייצרים את העוצמה השלישית, שהיא העוצמה המדינית. הסכמי השלום הללו הם הוכחה לכך שישראל בפריחה מדינית חסרת תקדים במדינות אפריקה, במדינות אסיה, במדינות אמריקה הלטינית. זה שינוי עצום. הם באים אלינו, כי הם יודעים שאנחנו מעצמה בהרבה תחומים. מעצמה טכנולוגית, מעצמת סייבר, מעצמת מים, עוד מעט גם מעצמת גז. הסכמי השלום הללו שברו את הווטו הפלסטיני. במשך 20 שנה אמרו לנו שאי אפשר לעשות שלום עם מדינות ערב בלי לעשות קודם לכן ויתורים מסוכנים תמורת השלום עם הפלסטינים. רק לאחרונה, ממש לפני כמה שבועות, אמר ראש ממשלה ישראלי לשעבר, ציטוט, שום מדינה ערבית, שום מדינה סונית מתונה, אף לא אחת, תקיים יחסים גלויים עם ישראל. זה הכל קשקוש מקושקש. כל עוד לא נפתרת הבעיה הפלסטינית, אין שום סיכוי שהמדינות האלה, שהן יעשו צעד אחד לחשוף את הקשרים הסמויים שיש לנו איתם, כל עוד הבעיה הפלסטינית לא תיפתר. אני זוכר איך אמר דיפלומט בכיר אחר, אם ישראל לא תעשה שלום עם הפלסטינים, לא יהיה לה שלום עם מדינות ערב. יש פה את הדגל של האמירויות והדגל של בחריין. הוכחנו אחרת. אני רק יכול לקוות שהקהילה הבינלאומית הפיקה את הלקח. מי שיחזור למדיניות התלויה בהסכמה הפלסטינית, בווטו הפלסטיני, יחכה עוד דור שלם לשלום שלא יתגשם. הפלסטינים עדיין מסרבים להכיר בהצהרת בלפור. הם רוצים לתבוע את בריטניה על הצהרת בלפור מלפני 103 שנים. הם לא עושים איתנו שלום לא בגלל ההתיישבות היהודית בנחלת אבותינו ביהודה ושומרון, אלא משום שהם מסרבים להכיר בישראל כמדינת הלאום של העם היהודי. האם הפלסטינים יכולים להשתנות? או מה ישתנה קודם? תמיד גרסו שפריצת דרך עם הפלסטינים תביא לפריצת דרך עם העולם הערבי. אבל אני במשך שנים אומר שהתהליך הזה כנראה יעבוד הפוך. שהתקדמות ופריצות דרך עם העולם הערבי יביאו בסופו של דבר לשינוי בעמדתם של הפלסטינים. אני מקווה שיום אחד הם יכירו במדינת ישראל כמדינת הלאום של העם היהודי. בזכותנו להתקיים פה בבולדתנו. זה היום שצריך להגיע. ועד שהיום הזה יגיע, נמשיך לשמור על ביטחון ישראל, נמשיך לטפח כלכלה חופשית ועוצמתית, ונמשיך לעשות שלום עם כל מי שרוצה בשלום אמת איתנו. תודה רבה לכם.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. It is no secret that one of the driving forces behind the Trump vision and the Abraham Accords was David Friedman, United States Ambassador to Israel. It's therefore a great privilege to invite Ambassador Friedman to be interviewed by the editor-in-chief of the Israel היום daily newspaper, Mr. Boaz Bismuth.
Ambassador Friedman, great honor to have you with us today to host you. And Mr. Ambassador, well, America will hold an election in less than a month against the backdrop of a changed Middle East. Iran is under immense pressure and deterred due to the killing of Soleimani. Israel's status is significantly improved and its ties with the Arab world are stronger than ever. Russia is in check in Syria, as we can see. Now, can you say, Ambassador Friedman, that the peace deals in the Middle East between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain are the chief foreign policy accomplishment of the Trump administration?
Well, thank you, Boaz. It's great to be with you. And I think the peace agreements with UAE and Bahrain are certainly among the greatest achievements, foreign policy achievements in the Trump administration. But I think you need to look at all of it holistically. I think it began with the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the moving of the embassy, recognizing the Golan Heights as being part of Israeli sovereign territory, the recognition that Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal. All of those were building blocks along the way to a policy which I think demonstrated to the entire region that, that one can be pro-Israel without doing damage or, God forbid, causing conflict or war within the Middle East. And I think it created a platform for countries like the UAE and Bahrain, and there'll be others, to come in. So certainly the peace agreement, which happens, once in a generation, if at all, certainly the peace agreement is a crowning achievement of President Trump's first term. But I think you have to look at it not in isolation, but as part of an overall strategy where the Trump administration has stood with and empowered its allies and taken a much harsher view of its enemies. And I think that's why we are where we are today.
You mentioned, Ambassador, the transfer of the embassy, which was a huge event. I mean, I remember being there. I was one of the lucky guests, of course. And for you personally, having your desk transferred from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, what an event. But at that time, if you remember, people were telling us that it will cause all the Middle East is going to burn. Were you Americans at the time, the administration at the time, were confident enough to know that this would not be the case?
We were confident that this would not set the Middle East on fire. At the same time, we prepared for the worst. So we were gauging the reaction or the potential reaction all throughout the region, from as far west as Morocco to as far east as Pakistan. We were checking in with our embassies. We were, collecting our intelligence. So we were preparing for the worst case, but the more we prepared, the more we were confident that that not only would this not set the world on fire, but actually it was a very positive step forward, because it showed that America is willing to keep its promises and stand with its allies. And we have many allies in the region. And I think other allies recognized that America was a good friend that could be trusted. So it went according to plan, and I think it set the stage for many further successes.
So you mentioned your allies, and I think immediately of new possible friends. So who's next to join the bandwagon after you had the Emirates and Bahrain? Who's next?
Well, look, I don't want to get ahead of any other countries. They all have their own time frames. They all have their own sensitivities. But I think just looking at the reaction of other nations to the peace agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, you can tell that there are others that endorse what we've done. They support the move, and the body language is very promising. Beyond the body language, I mean, we've had lots of conversations with other nations. There will be more countries, more nations that are in the Arab League will normalize and make peace with Israel. I have no doubt. It is a certainty. How many, in what order, I think everyone's just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah. When we think of countries, immediately you think next, though, Sudan, for example, or Oman. Without revealing name of countries, might we have surprises? Are there any countries that might be a surprise for Israelis or people of the world to discover that we might have relations with them?
I think people that are watching this closely shouldn't be surprised at any breakthrough, because they're all potentially out there. Some are more likely than others, and there's been lots of people trying to predict. But I do believe that with exceptions of obvious exceptions like Hezbollah-led Lebanon, or Assad-led Syria, or Khamenei-led Iran. I mean, with those kind of obvious exceptions, we're not almost everything else is potential. And I'll tell you, I think over time, as even the greatest of Israel's enemies see the trends and see which way the wind is blowing, I think they will all be confronted with a pretty tough choice about whether they want to be on the wrong side of history or whether they want to join the circle of peace. It's a much better pathway for the people of the region, and it may take a little bit of time for some of the more challenging countries, but it is certainly, I believe, the trend and the wave of the future.
Mm-hmm. You know, Ambassador, some are more lucky than others. You're ambassador right now in Jerusalem. I emphasize on Jerusalem. I was ambassador in Nouakchott. So a little difference, I would say. In my embassy, I remember 2005, the two of my diplomats went to the Emirates. It was very, very secret at the time due to their foreign passport. Now we can reveal it. It was a secret. But thanks to you, we can reveal it at last. Why do I say that? Because at that time, I mean, those diplomats serving there at the Emirates were so discreet. And now all of a sudden, not only that we do it openly, we're going to have an embassy, planes are going to come from the Emirates. And the most important thing for me is to see the people in the Emirates being happy and in front of camera, dancing, chanting, and being so happy about it. What was the trigger? What made this big difference that for 10 years, I mean, we used to do things discreet. Israel was, if you want, the lover, and now we are the official wife. What made that difference?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of things. The first, I think, is the leadership of both the Emirates and Bahrain on one hand and the Prime Minister on the other. They saw this as being in the best interests of their people. You know, Israel, as you know as well as I, has had covert relations with lots of different countries, or certainly they've been reported to have covert relations with lots of countries. There's only so far you can get with a covert relationship. You can't have tourism, you can't have trade, you can't have flights, you can't have real commercial engagement, and you can't really build a meaningful peace, because a peace without popular support will only get you so far. So I think the real credit goes to the leadership. It goes to the Crown Prince, it goes to the King, it goes to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and of course, more than anyone, it goes to President Trump, because he established a level of trust that had been so lacking for the last 8 years or even longer, that it enabled, everybody. There's an expression, for someone to jump into a pool, they have to be confident that there's water, right? And what President Trump did is he gave everybody the assurances that there was water in the pool, that once they jumped in, that there would be a favorable reception, that the United States would stand with them, would be with them, would support them. And I think all of that put together created the assurances. Again, the people-to-people engagement is absolutely critical for there to be a warm peace. And what we're seeing now, in just small things, we're going to get a flight next week probably from the first flight of its kind from Etihad will land with commercial passengers in Ben Gurion. There's already kosher food operations in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. The people really want to make each other welcome. And to me, that's the most exciting thing of all, because from there really is, the sky is really the limit.
Yeah, you speak about flights, so I think immediately that we're more lucky than them in that peace deal, because when the flights are going to come, they're a green country, we're a red country, so we won in that specific case, but that's a Corona era. That's why I had to mention it. When you mentioned your answer about the Emirates, Ambassador, surprisingly, after reading the Israeli media, you did not mention the F-35. So the F-35 had nothing to do with this peace deal between Israel and the Emirates.
Well, no. Look, I mean, you can read the treaty that was signed by the parties. It doesn't mention anything about weaponry. Now, look, we're gonna have to address requests from the Emirates for F-35s and other weaponry. We would address those issues with or without a peace agreement. They've made that request of the United States government, and the United States will have to process that request. They'll do so the same way they've done it in the past. They'll engage commentary from Israel. They'll work with their partners in Israel and with other countries in the region to find the way to achieve two things. Number one, to help make the Emirates as strong as possible, because frankly, it's tremendously helpful both to America and to Israel to have a strong ally on the Straits of Hormuz. So that's a win for everybody. At the same time, to do it in a way which doesn't jeopardize Israel's qualitative military edge, which is a law of the United States of America that we must adhere to. All of that is going to get worked out. It would get worked out either way, and it's going to get worked out by professionals, by by people who are experts in these issues. That would not include me. That would not include most people in the political echelons. It's handled by real professional experts. They've done this many, many times before. They sit together without publicity, without none of them are known to the press, and they work it out and they get it right. And I believe that'll happen here as well. I really do think it's a win-win. Israel will keep its military edge, and Israel and the United States will have an ally on the Straits of Hormuz that is as strong as possible.
An important question, Ambassador, even for me and for many who are watching us right now, because regarding the sovereignty bid, Israel, especially the Israel right, I would say, is a bit confused. It is their understanding that Israel was on the verge of extending sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, and maybe even more. But then a new tone came out of Washington, pulling this bid on hold. Can we once and for all maybe understand what's the current status of this bid and whether this will actually one day take place?
Sure. Well, Boaz, as you know, in January, we published a Trump vision for peace. And in contrast to all those who went before us, we actually provided the geographic dimensions of that vision for peace, along with a narrative that made it very clear that it's the position of the United States that Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria will never be evacuated, that we don't think it's in Israel's interest or America's interest to ever ask any communities in Judea and Samaria to disband or to evacuate. So we made that very clear in January, and even before that, as you know, Secretary Pompeo made it clear that Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria don't violate international law. So we begin with that. Now, as a step forward, we were all working forward to what we thought was a productive next step in the peace plan, which was to recognize Israeli sovereignty over at least some of the communities within Judea and Samaria that were on the map. Maybe all, certainly some. And we were moving along that path. We ran into some headwinds. One was the pandemic, which really put a huge limitation on how we could engage diplomatically. Second was a unity government in which at least two of the three highest-ranking members of the government, the defense minister and the foreign minister, took a very different view, a very negative view on the sovereignty issue, at least in isolation. And as we were struggling with those issues, and I think you're aware of the efforts we put in to try to create some consensus position within the government of Israel, as all that was happening, we saw an opportunity that we did not envision as we were moving forward, an opportunity for Israel to make peace with the Emirates, and we also saw additional countries were likely to follow. And I think we all kind of took a step back, and I think you have to credit the Trump administration. Most governments function like aircraft carriers. They're not nimble, they're not able to turn, they're not able to steer. We looked at the situation and said, you know what? Today there is an Israeli flag flying over Hebron, Shiloh, Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, Eli. They're all flying there today, and under our plan, they're going to be flying there forever. So that's not an immediate concern. What is an immediate opportunity is the ability to make peace with an Arab country, a major Arab country, an important Arab country. And so I think we all took a step back and said, this is a higher priority. And so we prioritized the peace initiative over the sovereignty initiative. But I want to make it clear, it was a prioritization. We didn't say, let's do this and shelve that. We said, let's put normalization, let's put peace first. And when we created a joint statement among the U.S., Israel, and the Emirates, we used the word suspend the sovereignty, not cancel, not abandon, but suspend. Suspend is, by definition, temporary. So the answer to your question, and I apologize for it being long-winded, but the answer to your question is the United States believes in the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria being there permanently. We believe that in the long run, it is in Israel's interest and American interests for Israel to extend its sovereignty over these communities. We also believe that it is Israel's highest and most important priority, as is ours, to extend the circle of peace for as far and as long as it will go, and to really make that our first priority. It is not to the exclusion, to the ultimate exclusion of sovereignty, but it is a priority. So if your follow-up question is, when will sovereignty occur? I wish I had an answer for you. We're going to spend at least from the perspective of the United States, we'd like to spend all of our efforts in the near future on diplomatic efforts, push the diplomatic agenda as far as it will take us, make Israel as safe, secure, and prosperous among all the nations in the region, create as much peace as possible, reduce the threat level as much as possible, and then when we feel that we've exhausted those efforts, of course, to try to formalize help Israel at least formalize its boundaries in a way that includes its sovereignty over the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria.
I see. Only to understand, to make sure that I understood, Ambassador Friedman, I mean, peace is priority, but in the future, we'll have, I don't say we might have, but we'll have both peace and sovereignty.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's a good thing. As you mentioned, other countries, and there is a country that is kind of important, I would say, in the region, even very important, to join in this peace treaty. And my question is, why isn't Saudi Arabia joining us already?
Well, look, you know, if you're able to get an interview with them, I'm sure you'll ask them. I don't want to speak for Saudi Arabia. I can tell you, though, that Saudi Arabia has been enormously helpful to this process in an obvious way. It takes a little bit over 3 hours now to fly from Ben Gurion Airport to Abu Dhabi or to Manama. Without Saudi Arabia, that flight would take about 7 hours. Israel, for the first time in its history, has commercial overflight rights to these countries over Saudi Arabia. I would not minimize that. I mean, that's a very significant signal. So my view is, look, like every other country, let's respect the Saudis to go through this process at their own pace, deal with this issue as they see fit. But we're all pretty happy right now with the help we've gotten from the Saudis, and I hope that it grows and expands.
Ambassador, we spoke about so many achievements, and we're only talking about the first term. President Trump is running for a second term. All those beautiful things that we talked about, peace process and sovereignty, possibility of sovereignty in the coming years, does it all depend on Trump winning the elections in November? Do you think that the Biden administration will put an end or a stop to all this beautiful process we're having?
Well, look, I obviously am not equipped to speak for the Biden administration. I think with regard to the Trump administration, if we're honored enough to be able to continue to serve the American people for a second term, the opportunities here in this part of the world are enormous. Look, what is Iran's strategy? Iran's strategy is to pray 5 times a day that Trump loses. Okay, that's their strategy, because they know that if Trump wins, they have no exit strategy from the pressure we've put on them, short of ending their malign activity. What's the Palestinian strategy? You heard Prime Minister Steyer say yesterday, we have to pray that Donald Trump loses. Right? That's their strategy, because they know that the Trump administration will hold the Palestinians accountable to end incitement, to end terrorism, to stop glorifying in town squares terrorists who were responsible for mass atrocities, to create an infrastructure of transparency and religious freedom. We care about that. We're the only administration that's ever held the Palestinians accountable to join the civilized world. What's the Palestinian strategy? We hope he loses. So if we're able to have another 4 years, I think that those countries that whose only strategy is to hope we're gone, I think they'll have no choice but to engage in a productive way, and hopefully we can really change the Middle East for 100 years and end all the dangerous and malign and inhuman activity that has brought so much despair to so many people in this region. So, I don't want to speak for what Biden would do, but I can tell you that the way to continue on the path is for us to have another 4 years.
Two last questions, Ambassador. We can't speak about Biden, but we can speak about President Trump. Can you tell us a little bit, reveal us about his plans concerning Iran in case President Trump has a second term? Because we hear of possible negotiations, we hear of a possible good perspective for the Iranian people. What can you tell us about that?
Well, look, I think the president has expressed some optimism that in his second term he might be able to make a deal with Iran. But let's just be clear what that means. We've been very clear, the Secretary of State's been very clear about what Iran has to do to sit at the table with the United States, the requirements that they would have to agree to. Now, look, there's only one way to get them to that point. It's through strength. It's through continued pressure, and it's through a continued, serious and non-bending approach to their malign activity. I think the president is optimistic that path will work. I think he's also expressed a good deal of pessimism that if he's no longer the president, that at least what's been expressed as the alternative view, going back to the JCPOA, that might rear its ugly head. If it does, I think I've said this before. I would be very concerned that all of the hard work that we've put into changing the perspectives within Iran, that it might go to waste. Let's hope it doesn't happen. Our policy is best for America. It's best for the world. It's best for Israel. It's best for the region. And whoever's sitting in the White House, let's hope that policy continues.
Mm-hmm. Allow me for the last question to be a bit personal and to be very, as an Israeli, but I think that all the people of the region must be very grateful to you, Ambassador Friedman, for the contribution for peace in the region. But permit me maybe a last personal question. Trump wins, you stay with us?
Well, you make it sound as if it's my choice. I mean, if president wins, I work for the president. If the president wants me to stay on, I will serve my country. I will serve the president. It's been the greatest honor of my life to serve in this role, working with President Trump and his team, with Jared and Avi and with Jason before him, with the National Security Advisor, with Secretary Pompeo, with Vice President Pence. This has been a labor of love. I mean, this has been really just one of the great dream teams that I think have ever been built with regard to representing America in this region, and I sure would like to keep that going.
Great. So Trump wins, you stay. You gave us another reason why we wish him a lot of success. Thank you very much, Ambassador Friedman. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Bo. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome to the first panel session today on Israel's stand in the Middle East after the signature of the Abrahamic peace treaties with the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain. My name is Eldad Beck, Europe correspondent of the daily Israel, היום, and one of the first Israeli journalists to have traveled in the Arab world in countries which didn't and still don't have relations with Israel. I will be moderating this debate, if it's going to be a debate, maybe just a dialogue. Allow me to introduce the participants in the panels. From Abu Dhabi, we have Dr. Najat Saeed, Saudi and American researcher, columnist and commentator writing on media, politics, and women's rights. From Dubai, Mrs. Sukaina El-Mashekhi, Saudi TV moderator, columnist, and a prominent voice on women's rights in the Gulf region. In July 2018, she wrote a very courageous article in the Saudi newspaper Al-Yawm, calling to recognize Israel. From Manama in Bahrain, Amjad Taha, British Arab researcher and commentator, head of the Gulf office of the British Middle East Center for Studies and Research, a prominent voice for the normalization between the Arab world and Israel. From Tel Aviv, we have Professor Eyal Zisser, the Vice Rector of Tel Aviv University and the holder of the Yona and Dina Ettinger Chair in Contemporary History of the Middle East. And last but not least, Boaz Bismuth, editor-in-chief of Israel, היום, who among the many things that he has done in his life was the former Israeli ambassador to Mauritania. Translator to and from Arabic is Tzachi Fenton from Elkanah. The first question to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to what extent are the Abrahamic treaties a game changer in the acceptance of Israel in the Middle East? Who would like to take it first?
So maybe if you allow me to start, Eldad, I would start maybe with a story. You mentioned that I was ambassador in Mauritania. And that's a very good way of starting, I think, those Abraham Accord. And why? Because, I mean, I know the importance of the relationship, the official and formal relationship between an Arabic country or between the Arab world and Israel. Now, I remember very well, I mean, the ambassador that I was, that sometimes I was not the, I would say that I was treated sometimes even by officials as the mistress, meaning you would see me at night. You wouldn't see me usually at events, I mean, with other ambassadors. For example, if there was a new movie that came to town and you'll have like a cultural event, then the Israeli ambassador would not be always invited because it might offend other ambassadors from the Arab world. And why this Abraham Accord is so important? Because I do remember one day in 2005, two of my embassy who had foreign passport were called by Jerusalem and were sent to the Emirates, because we used to have an office over there, but it was not official as everybody knows today, because today that's not a secret anymore. And for me, why is this accord so important? Because what we used to do sometimes, discreetly, you can do it at last openly. And this is a huge change. Another thing, if you want, you know, you and me, Eldad, I mean, we remember, the peace treaty with Egypt. We remember the peace treaty with Jordan. We remember how it was accepted or not accepted by public opinion. I even remember in 1993, after the Oslo agreement with the Palestinians, I was sent by newspaper to the Palestinian camps, Al-Husseini in Jordan. And I remember the hostility towards those agreements. And now what do you see? You see in the Emirates and you see our new friends in Bahrain being as happy as we are by this all new or open friendship that we have. So for me, maybe one of the biggest changer, because we'll speak later on about strategy, we'll speak about many things, but it's really, you can feel that this is really peace, that it's something that you do between people and not between only governments. Also peace that you do from up, but especially also from downwards. And this is for me a big, big change in all the philosophy of peace in the Middle East.
Let's try and see it now from the Arab side. Any of the Arab participants, maybe Dr. Najat Saeed?
I agree with most of what has been mentioned, almost all of what has been mentioned. And I will add something. I believe the main changes that happened through these peace treaties, that it is considered as throwing a stone in a static pond. We know all that this conflict has been for ages without a valid solution. But now with this kind of peace treaty is different. I believe it is different from two perspectives. First of all, the Arab Gulf states are quite different in their mentality compared to the other Arabs. First of all, they are pragmatic and they are free from other ideologies, both the leaders and majority of the people. So they're going to be thinking more pragmatically in how they can work out these kind of peace treaties. This is number one. And number two, they will be setting an example of how peace treaty is an example to the others. Like the peace treaties that happened in Egypt and Jordan were mainly government to government. It wasn't people to people, so it was called peace. I consider it more as no war peace. So with this one, it's not truly a peace. It's like no war treaties. This is how I consider it. But with this kind of peace treaty is more one peace because it's more people to people. And I can see already the outcome, the positive outcome, especially through the UAE Israeli Business Council. I can see already Israeli visitors are visiting with warm welcoming from Emiratis, and they're dealing with business. Let's talk about politics. So the politics here is more dealt with the government, and the people are dealing with business. And this is something new to the region. And from that point, I see it very, very positive.
Amjad Taha, peace, normalization, how would you call what is happening right now?
I would call it a pace and a game changer, but let me start with a Jewish quote that says in Hebrew, "Lo mashine kamtit kadim bet yot hai kashachi nacha oster." I know I didn't say it very right, but it means it doesn't matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop. And hopefully, this train of peace and prosperity does not stop right now, because of this. I mean, it's a game changer, but because of a historical deception and a mistake in which communists and socialists and religious extremists took part in, and there was a kind of inaccurate impression of a state of Israel was created, which led to its failure to be accepted in the Arab region, and I'm sure the ambassador can confirm that later on. But with the development of the events and the let's call it the biosphere of knowledge, the Arabs were dividing right now into three types. Let's say the type which is the Gulf type, which has suffered from the terrorism of the Palestinian terrorist movement, such as Abu Nidal organization, ANO, which was part of the PLO, which carried attacks on Saudi flights in 1974 and Bahrain 771 flights, Gulf Air flight, and assassinated the UAE's ambassador in France in 1984 and killed the Kuwaiti diplomat in 1982 in India, and so on. So these countries with their people and their leadership who stood for years with the people of Palestine and sent billions of financial assets to build cities, schools, mosques, hospitals, you call it whatever, in all these areas where Palestinians live. But in return, they had a denial, insult, or almost let's call it a hostility from some of the Palestinians. With the PLO right now, this is a game changer, especially when we look at the PLO right now and all the corruption and the missionaries that they have in it. And the recent move that the PLO did, lining up with Erdogan's regime, which occupies the western Libya and the northern Syria and commits crimes against the Kurds and the Armenians before, and with Mahmoud Abbas being meeting the Iranian militias leaders in Gaza, Hamas and so on, it became clear to everyone that the right solution right now is to go for peace and to get any rights. And that the people of Palestine right now are the hostage of criminals and the group of gangs who wants money, not peace. They don't want a homeland. They don't want a land. They just want a kind of like money, and that's about it. So the Gulf type, that type of understanding, while the second type of the Arabs are the countries which suffered from the anti-terrorism, anti-Israel slogans. And now we're talking about the regimes such as the ones in Syria. People didn't get anything in Syria apart from, as a result of that, apart from destruction and poverty and so on. Even the Palestinian gangs participated in killing the Syrian people in the Syrian civil war, the recent one. And the Lebanese who suffered from the Palestinian gangs in the Damo massacre in 1976 and so on, and the Iraqi people who suffered from Saddam just putting slogans against Israel, and they didn't get nothing as a result apart from poverty. So that type, now we have the type of the Gulf who understands that, and the type which suffered from the whole being against Israel, and the other type which understands that type understands war will not bring the type that we have. I think that they are the third type, which are the time-worn generation. Let's say the old generation, the Orthodoxians. They are still being deceived. Let's hope for them to change and fade out.
Sukaina, do you see what has happened, these treaties, as a fundamental change toward Israel?
نعم، هنالك تغير دعني أقول في نمو القبول الإسرائيلي عربياً. توقيع اتفاق أبراهام ليس بالضرورة شيء على بياض بالنسبة لإسرائيل، لكن يعني هنالك فرق بين التطبيع على المستوى الشعبي وبين توقيع اتفاقيات سلام على المستوى السياسي. يعني سابقاً وقعت مصر وأيضاً الأردن اتفاقيتي سلام، ولكن لم يكن هنالك اختراق سلمي شعبي، يعني بقيت الشعوب بعيدة عن بعضها البعض. حالياً دعني أقول في التوجه الخليجي في هذه المرحلة أجد بأن هنالك قبول شعبي يعني آخذ بالتنامي والتزايد في الشارع الخليجي، وهذا تعتبر شيء جديد على مجتمعاتنا العربية، ربما لأن طبيعة المجتمعات الخليجية تختلف، أو ربما لأن بعد دول الخليج أيضا يعني بعيدة عن إسرائيل، وربما لأننا أيضا لم نخوض أي حروب سابقة مع إسرائيل. لذلك أنا أجد بأن هنالك علاقة، هنالك قبول أيضا بالنسبة إلى حركة القوميون العرب. نعم ما زال لها بقايا رغم أنها انحلت في سنة 70، ولكن ما زال هنالك بقايا من القوميون، ولكن ليسوا بنسبة كبيرة كالسابق. يعني لو بدأت مثلا مرحلة السلام مع إسرائيل قبل سنوات في فترة وجود مثلا جماعة الإخوان المسلمين في مصر وغيرها من دول، سنجد بأن هنالك معارضة كبيرة من الشارع الخليجي. ولكن هذا توقيت الاتفاقيات التي تمت بين البحرين وأيضا بين الإمارات كان التوقيت الحقيقي لهذه الاتفاقيات. الشارع الخليجي بدأ، دعني أقول بأنه يبتعد كثيرا عن مناخ جماعة الإسلام السياسي، وأيضا الحركات الإصلاحية التي قامت بها الخليج جعلت هنالك يعني مناخ جيد يتقبل فيه الشارع الخليجي لأي اتفاقيات سلام.
Professor Zisa, I would like to start with a point that was brought up by Sukaina, which is the Qubul al-Sha'bi, the popular acceptance of Israel and of these agreements. We have the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies based in Doha, in Qatar, which published a poll, a very large poll with 30,000 people in 13 different Arab countries, that found that actually 88% of the Arabs are against recognition of the state of Israel. To what extent is such a poll, especially knowing that it's coming from Qatar, is reliable?
Well, I don't think it is reliable. Coming back to the agreements, I think it's a major breakthrough because the conventional wisdom, it's an earthquake in the sense that we shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, it was a slow process. We saw it coming, and still the conventional wisdom was that the Palestinians have a veto power, the Arab Street will refuse it, the Gulf states are not as important and central in the Arab world, and they will always look to Syria and Egypt. And what happened was that the door was open, and suddenly we look around and realize that the Palestinians are not as important, that the Gulf state became central. I mean, when nowadays you speak about the center of the Arab world, it's not anymore Cairo like it was in the 50s or 60s. People look at the Gulf. This is the center, not Damascus, and so on and so forth. Now, as to the Arab Street, I mean, we knew it all before that whenever an Egyptian intellectual or men in the street want to demonstrate against the regime because of, you know, his resentment and his domestic problems, he can't, of course, get to the street and shout against the ruler. So he used the anti-Israeli slogans. I mean, it's not that really people in the Arab world care or thought committed or thought, you know, that they should sacrifice themselves. It was a pretext. It was a tool. And I think that now people realize that it's not anymore the case. And as you rightly mentioned, especially when it comes from a country like Qatar, which was the first to normalize relations with Israel already back in the early 90s. But, well, they have to survive, you know, between the Iranians and Erdogan. And so they choose the radical, the evil side of the map.
Now, the special attitude of the Gulf countries, does it have to do only with the fact that they recognize that Israelis and Emiratis have Iran as the main enemy, or does it also have to do with some lessons that were taught by the failed Arab Spring and by the radicalism that we saw coming up from this movement. Who would go first on this question? Amjad?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I have a different perspective when it comes to the first thing. When it comes to the what we spoke about, the Azmi Bashar. Azmi Bashar is, we all know about this guy, how corrupted he is, and he's led by the Qatari regime and sponsored by those. And I mean, the same institution, his center, which said that there is not much popularity or support for the peace treaty. The same institution came up with the fact that Tripoli in Libya, West Libya, is a safe haven for economy and advanced economy. While we know Tripoli suffers from poverty and struggles from militias and so on. But obviously that center only did that because the extremist Islamic militias who are supported by the Qatari regime, they are the allies of Doha, and that's why the center only supports that, and that's about it. So, but when it comes to Iran and the outcome of the Arab Spring and having Iran as one of the enemies of the Arab world, I say, let's be honest. Many crimes and massacres in the world occurred because people were let to speak. They're very late to speak about the truth, or some knew the wound and decided to place a plaster of silence over it, or let's call it for the sake of the public interest, and because of the public numbing silence, and countries delayed to move against Hitler, and we witnessed the evilest Holocaust and the genocide against the Jews. Now, the same thing right now the Iranians are doing. The Nazi of the Middle East right now are the Iranians, the Nazis of the Middle East, and the haters of the Arabs, and the ones who are today suffering under the Iranian regime, from unlawful arrest to kidnapping to execution, exactly what the Jews suffered from Germany, are the people of the Arab people, even inside Iran. Today, the Arab people of Ahwaz, which is a country has been occupied by Iran since 1925, and there are more than 11 million Arabs, and are going through what the Jew went through in the era of the Nazis. Iran today is no different than the Nazis, than the Nazi Germany, with its racist and practice and ethnic cleansing towards the people, the Arab people, or the Ahwazi people, the 90% where the oil exists. When we see all the peace and prosperity and eventually reaching peace for the Palestinians and supporting even their rights to reach a fair deal with Israel, who doesn't like that? I tell you, all the radicals and the members of the Iranian regime who are the Nazis of the Middle East, the Iranian who have a problem with the Arab countries, they are the fascists, the racists towards all kind of the Arab part, apart from their militias, obviously. Since the 1970s, the Iranian have occupied 3 of the UAE islands. They have killed more than 4 million of the Arab during the whole wars with the Arab people. In Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, supported the terrorist attack. They supported all terrorist attack in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in the whole Gulf state, recently even in Kuwait, when they supported the whole Hezbollah's group in Kuwait and so on. So, I mean, imagine Iran had the nuclear. Israel did not blast explosion near the Kaaba, and they did not target the Mecca. They did not throw the missiles there. Israel did not manufacture militias that killed the Iraqi people or Yemen, or did not even swing a picture of Netanyahu in southern Lebanon. Iran did all that. Iran is occupying. Iran is killing all these people. So today, if there is an enemy of the Arab people and the Israeli and the humanity, it's Iran. And if the Palestinians... No, yes, go ahead.
Let me go to Najat. Is it only the Iranian threat, or is it also the recognition, which was quite visible during the Arab Spring, that the different Arab populations in the Arab world actually understood for the first time that their daily problem is not the Arab-Israeli conflict, that they have other problems, and if they want to solve these problems, they would rather have normalization with Israel?
Before I answer this question, but I want to go for the statistics, the one that you just mentioned, because unfortunately these days most of the statistics are politicized, and we can see that even in the U.S. election. We saw that. Let me give you, just to show you how much these numbers are so much politicized. So the numbers that the Qatari Foundation said that 88% of the Arabs are against recognition of Israel. If I compared these numbers to the studies that have been conducted by Trends, which is a think tank that is based in Abu Dhabi, it's completely the opposite. The study says that 80% of the Arab world do agree with the peace treaty. Okay, and the survey was done in both in Arabs in the Arab countries and also Arabs based in Western countries. Okay, 81% is a big percentage. It's not only that. The study also said that 45% agree strongly that peace agreements with Israel can contribute to achieving peace and stability in the whole Middle East. So they not only pro the peace treaty, they see positive outcome of it. And 39% strongly agree that peace agreements with Israel can contribute to countering terrorism. Okay, and 41% agree strongly that peace agreements with Israel can contribute to economic and social development. And 33% strongly agree that peace agreements with Israel can contribute to finding a comprehensive and just solution to the Palestinians themselves. So before we go, like now even when we see numbers, we should be watching where are these numbers are coming from, because a lot are playing with these numbers or go and send the survey to certain kind of people who are against it. Okay, who have already those extremist ideologies, who are dominated by these extremist ideologies. So I want to just highlight these numbers. And according also to the Zaghi Foundation, more than 56% of the Emiratis are pro the peace treaty, which is quite a big percentage. That means that more than half of the population is pro this peace treaty. And according to the same study, the Zaghi Foundation, more than 59% of the Saudi population support this peace treaty. So that all of these are actual numbers that are based on studies which completely different than the Qatari Foundation's numbers. Going back to your question, whether the Iranian cause is the only cause, definitely not. Is not the only cause. Okay, the Iranian threat is actually number one threat to the Arab Gulf states since 1979, since the Khomeini revolution. It's not something new. And from the beginning, Israel wasn't the first enemy for the Arab Gulf states. But nobody dares to say that in public. Now the public can say it openly. From ages ago, the Israel was never the first enemy to the Arab Gulf states people, and even to the leaders, because as Amjad said, Israel is not the one that is throwing the missiles on us. Israel is not the one that is arming militias against us. We are against Israel only because of the Palestinians. We don't have a direct conflict between us and Israel. All what we are doing because of the Palestinians, not because of ourselves. So that's the main thing. Our main problem, our main enemy since the late 70s is the Iranian regime since 1979. So that's the first enemy. Going back and to the other circumstances that happened in the region, there are many things that contributed that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not our priority. First of all, the generation has changed. Now the younger generation is thinking about economy, is thinking about employment, are so worried about the first threat to their national security. Is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the first threat to the national security of the Arab Gulf people? No. Okay, this is number one. So the second thing, the events that happened in the region got even more complicated. Like Iran was a threat, as I said, since 79, but it became much more threat now because it almost occupied four Arab states. Yes, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So its threat is becoming even more now. Now we have an adding problem to Iran, which is Erdogan Turkey. He's as insane as the Iranian regime. He's expanding everywhere, even to Europe. So that is also another threat. So, according, for example, and it varies from country to country regarding the first threat. Like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, definitely the first threat is the Iranian regime. But in other Arab countries, like, for example, UAE or even Egypt, the first threat to them is the Erdogan Turkey, because he's supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, but both of them consider the Iranian regime and the Erdogan Turkey are their main threats. Okay, the third main reason also, after the Arab Spring, most of the Arab states have failed, unfortunately. So now the Arab Gulf states are surrounded with failed states. So accordingly, when you are is surrounded by failed Arab states, that is dangerous to yourself. Because failed states, what does it mean? Failed states means lack of national security, means more militias, means chaos. And since they are your neighbors, so accordingly, and eventually the threat will come to your place, your country. So this is another threat. So what we need.
With your permission, Boaz, Jad spoke about the generational aspect of what's happening in the Middle East towards Israel. You've been reporting during the Arab Spring also from countries like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and many others. Did you have the feeling that the younger Arab generations are more open to accept and coexist with Israel?
So, I'm happy that you remind me that I used to be your big rival. I used to wake up in the morning and see where you are in order to see if you were before me in any country that we used to go with foreign passport. And now, luckily, we can go with an Israeli passport. And this is amazing. And you agree with me. Now, you're asking me about this new generation. And I have to tell you one thing. I'm listening to this panel and I'm thrilled. I am really, how would I say? I will go to sleep tonight a more optimistic man, although it's Corona time, although we still have a lot of problems in the world. Let's be honest. But at the same time, what do we see in this panel? We see Israelis, of course. We know us, but we have also our three friends from the Gulf country, our three new friends, who think we do not share only the same threats when you speak about Iran, but we also we look so much the same, and we also share the same values, and we care about our region, and we care about the children, and we care about our future, and we're going to share this land with the same values and future. And this is something amazing that is happening now in the Middle East. And this panel shows, because when you listen to us, to Professor Zissa, or to myself, or to you, Eldad, and we listen to our friends from the Gulf country, honestly, sometimes you think that we speak the same, and this is amazing, and this is a big change, and this also answers your question. But let me tell you one thing. The lady before me spoke about those failed states. And I would say two things, that also brought this agreements, these Abraham agreements that we have today. Of course, it's a process. And with Bahrain, we had negotiations, and with the Emiratis, etc., etc. But I would say that in the Arab Spring in 2011, and this speaking about those young generation, they discovered, the lady spoke about failed states. I would speak about this failure of the state nation in the Arab world. They tried to create this state nation, and in order to succeed, to put this glue, what was the glue? Anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. And I remember in Tahrir Square, as a journalist, when I had to cover the Tahrir Square, like you, Eldad, and then this big Tuesday with like 1 million people. There were I don't know if 1 million, but there were so many people. And there were two ways to go inside. One way was to come inside this Tahrir Square from the Salafists, and the other one from the young generation. So I preferred to go through the young generation, where you had people with jeans and like us, like in Tel Aviv. And I remember they asked for my passport, and I was very surprised they asked for my passport. And I said, why? And I said, to make sure you're not Israeli, not Israelis allowed. Meaning at the beginning, still, they were very hostile at the beginning. And then, as the process continued, you remember, we had in Israeli channels, young Egyptians who gave interviews, and now you can see also the difference in the Egyptian streets. So I would say that this crisis, this state nation, and the cause that create, all those inventions about Israel, the demonization of Israel was, I think, stage number one. Stage number two, as our friend said, It is true that with Iran, the big, even religious crisis and the crisis between the countries and geographically and whatever you want between the Gulf countries and Iran is very old. This is true. But I mean, Iran attacking the Saudis, of course, and with the conflicts with the islands and the intervention in Bahrain, this is something that you can see today. And all of a sudden, they notice that Israel is not the threat at all. But Iran is not the only thing. You need much more than a common enemy. I would say for a common enemy, we would have continued our, how would I say, a certain normalization at night beyond the curtain, not under the light. But I would say that you need something much more deep and much more concrete. And you know, if you permit me, as we've got friends from the Gulf country, I remember in school when I was young, in a French school, we had a debate whether you should call it the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf. You remember this, Eldad, like me. So with Israel, maybe soon they'll call it the Arab Gulf again. Who knows?
Sukaina, there is no doubt that the Palestinians have suffered over the years. Much of this suffering was inflicted upon themselves by themselves. Do you have the feeling that in the Arab world, people are quite fed up with a Palestinian leadership that is incapable of taking any decision and that is willing to do something constructive, not only for the Palestinian people, but also for the whole Middle East?
بالنسبة لعملية قبول إسرائيل في العالم العربي، عدوي صديقي. تلك إحدى شفرات القبول العربي لإسرائيل، وكلما أمعنت إيران في استعداء دول الخليج خاصة والعربية عامة كان ذلك على حساب إيران، رغم أنها دولة مسلمة ولكنها غير مسالمة، بل أنها دولة أقرب ما تكون للسلوك الصبياني التخريبي العبثي، وهي وأذرعتها في المنطقة متمثلة بحزب الله، الحوثيين، الحشد الشعبي، حماس وغيرهم. العرب لا يحبون إيران بطموحاتها التوسعية واختراقاتها المستمرة لأمنهم وسلامتهم واستقرارهم، لذلك كل خطوة تهدد أمنهم يقابلها قبول بإسرائيل والتعاون معها أمنياً وعسكرياً إذا اقتضى الأمر. لن تتوقف إيران عن التمدد والاختراق الأمني والسياسي، وبالتالي يتنامى كرهها مقابل قبول لإسرائيل في الشارع، مما يعني أنه بجانب موضوعية السلام بصورة عامة أن إسرائيل تكسب أرضية عربية مؤيدة لها بصورة متصاعدة، ما ينفي مع خرافة الاستطلاعات التي تحدثتم عنها سابقاً، التي يعني يبدو أنها موجهة من قبل جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أو ولاية الفقيه لبناء نسبة مئوية غير حقيقية لعدم قبول إسرائيل واستمرار المتاجرة بالقضية الفلسطينية. بالنسبة إلى هل سئم العالم العربي من الفلسطينيين ورغبتهم الظاهرة في استمرار الصراع مع إسرائيل إلى الأبد؟ بحسب المزاج الجماهيري الذي من الممكن تلمسه في مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي، وأيضاً من خلال التصريحات من قبل النخب الثقافية العربية بشكل عام والخليجية بشكل خاص، أجد بأن العرب أصبحوا أكثر وعياً بأن القيادات الفلسطينية المتتالية كانت من مصلحتها أن لا ينتهي الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي، لأنهم يتكسبون من هذه القضية بدءاً من أبو عمار مروراً أو وصولاً إلى محمود عباس. بعد سنوات طويلة استيقظ العرب على حقيقة متاجرة قيادات الفلسطينية بها، وبأن ما جناه العرب من مناصرة القضية الفلسطينية هو صفر كبير، وما جنته القيادة الفلسطينية هي حسابات متضخمة في بنوك أوروبا. لذلك أتمنى من كل الدول الخليجية وضع حد لهذه المهزلة التي تقوم بها القيادات الفلسطينية، وقيام جميع الدول بتوقيع اتفاقيات سلام بشكل عاجل مع إسرائيل.
Now, before I will ask you a final question about the effects of the American election on the Middle East. Professor Zisser, Sukaina referred to a very interesting term, al-mutajara bil-qadiyya al-Filistiniya, the commerce in the Palestinian problem. Do you see any situation in which the Palestinians finally free themselves from this attitude?
Well, I'm afraid I don't see any breakthrough or change in the future. I mean, the reaction of the Palestinian to the signing of those agreements, instead of joining this peace process, instead of sending the good wishes. All what we heard was sharp and condemnations and attacks against the Gulf states that, well, Egypt was the one that shed, you know, under Anwar Sadat shed its blood for the Palestinian, but the Gulf states did a lot for the Palestinians, and still the reaction was as we have seen. I wouldn't say it's a lost case, but I don't see any change among the Palestinians. They still wait. They still count on the other to solve their problems, and anytime it's not working, the reaction is what we have seen right now.
And the final round, really in 2 sentences, each one of you. What would be the effects of a democratic victory in the US presidential election on the Middle East? Boaz.
Oh, it's easy. It's very easy. We'll make a big U-turn if we were driving a car, unfortunately. Again, I do not think that Mr. Biden is hostile to the Emirate countries or to Israel, but priority will change, and we might go back to the same old paradigm that totally failed. I mean, you have to go again to the Palestinians, and I totally agree with what Professor Zisser just now said, and unfortunately, this is something that we all have to remember. As long as for the Palestinians, it's more important for them, for Israel not to have a state, or for the Jews not to have a state, more important than for them to have a state, then we'll not go forward. And the second thing that is really important, I mean, you know, they always speak about, including Biden and this stuff, two-state solution. 1 second, in order to have two-state solution, you have to have 2 states. You have to have 2 nations. So when did the Palestinians accept the two-state solution? So again, this is why I do believe that we have a very good process, and voting Trump doesn't always mean that you're totally insane. On the contrary, maybe it's because you want peace in the region.
Najat? Just a minute, we don't hear you. Just a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I see that even though Joe Biden welcomed this peace treaty, but I believe the Mideast peace will lose its momentum if Biden comes to the White House. This is not because of him personally, but because of his surroundings. I personally don't see someone with the mindset of Jared Kushner, like in his loop. Okay, this is one thing. The other thing that I believe, when you say like two-state solution, we have to think: are those people really serious about peace? Since this problem has lasted for 72 years, I believe, frankly and honestly, there will never be peace or two-state solution with this current leadership. Bingo. And the Democrats will come to the box now, number 1, and will say there's no peace without talking with the Palestinians. Great. But with this leadership, no way, for 2 reasons. One, as Sukaina said, those people do not want solution and they're trading off with this conflict. And number 2, which is even more important, those leaderships, whether the one in Fatah or the one in Hamas, are driven out of ideologies. One is from leftist communist ideology, which is dominated by Fatah, and one by Islamist ideology with Hamas. Those people do not believe in peace and no two-state solution because they want to wipe out Israel out of the map. This is my opinion. This is what I think.
Thank you. Eyal?
Well, I think that, people in the region do understand that they can't always rely on the Americans. And I mean, the signing of the peace agreement, I don't think it was only because Trump put the pressure or asked, people in the region, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, realize, even Egypt realized that, well, they should unite, join forces together. And that's what I expect to see if there will be a change in Washington. The shift will be to what we in the region do in front of the Iranian threat, the Turkish challenge, what is going on in Iran, in Yemen, and I guess the United States will be less important than it was under Trump or years before.
Sukaina? We don't hear you. لا نسمعك.
اوكي. راح طبعا انا غير متخصصه في السياسه بشكل كبير زي دكتوره نجاة، لكن من وجهه نظري لطالما كانت الاداره الامريكيه وانتخاباتها عاملا حاسما ومهما لكلا طرفي الصراع العربي الاسرائيلي، وسيظل ذلك مؤثرا لفتره طويله. وفيما يخص الانتخابات الحاليه فان اسرائيل تعتمد بصوره كبيره على حظوظ الرئيس الحالي، لانه بدأ مع خطوات جريئه وقويه ومؤثره في صراعها مع الفلسطينيين. في حال كانت حظوظ المرشح الديمقراطي أكبر فربما لن يغير ذلك كثيرا في الواقع، ولكن لن يكون الدعم الأمريكي أعتقد بنفس الحيوية والجراءة الحالية، وستكون هناك موازنات أكثر وضوحا فيما يتعلق بالعامل الإيراني. مسيرة تطبيع الدول العربية والإسلامية لن تتوقف بعد تجربة اتفاقية أبرهام، لأن كثيرا من الدول بحاجة للتوافق مع إسرائيل لمواجهة التهديدات الإيرانية التي لن تتوقف وربما تزيد في حال تغيرت القيادة الأمريكية كما يرى البعض.
Thank you. Last but not least, Amjad.
Well, let's say we hope Biden wins, because we don't, I mean, when you experience heaven, you don't want to go back to hell again. I mean, and in regards to the Palestinian Authority, I always say even the viruses evolved, but the paddlers on the Palestinian Authority, they do not at all. Everyone is heading towards peace and prosperity, and even the Saudis and the rest of the other Arab Gulf nations. It depends on different path and pathology, and in different timing. It's important for our primary concern to be our national security and the future of our children among the nations, and not to be a hostage to the Palestinian cause on leadership and choices. Our main cause should be the peace and the rejection of extremism and corruption, and therefore to overthrow the West Bank Authority and the destroying the militias in Gaza, Libya, brotherhoods in Yemen, and defeat the occupation and terrorism of the Iranians in Iraq, Lebanon, Ahwaz, and so on. It's important for the region and today, and it is to make a kind of international force to boycott the Palestinian Authority, which has billions and billions and billions of dollars in Switzerland and Austria and South America, and is still stealing the aid to the people of Palestine and starving and arresting the youth and women in Palestine. The message is as follows: creating a bright future, peace, prosperity with the Israeli. There should not be a silence anymore when the militias throw a rocket and kill a soldier or injure a soldier in Nablus by the Palestinian. There shouldn't be a silence in the Arab world. There should be a condemnation, and we should condemn it, because if we go silent and we don't condemn it, the radicalization, the Islamic radical groups, they will use it. The Iranians, they will use it. No more silence. We and the Israelis, two normal countries, they want to live in peace and prosperity along each other's, and that's about it. Full stop. The rest doesn't matter. What happened in the past, it doesn't matter. We look to the future, and that's all we care about. It's a point. The whole Abrahamic Accord, it was a point of rebirth, reborn. The nation was reborn, a rebirth moment. Look forward. Stop looking backward.
سيداتي وسادتي، أشكر لكم لمشاركتكم في هذا الحوار المهم، وأتمنى لكل واحد منكم السلام والصحة. Thank you very much for participating in this very important panel discussion, and I wish you all peace and foremost health. Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes today's program. Thanks to all the participants. We will reconvene tomorrow at the same hour, 10 a.m. Eastern Time in the US, 5 p.m. in Israel. I look forward to seeing you then.
של יום חדש, יונת שלום, יונת תקווה ממריאה אל קו השלווה. האמירויות מסמקים ומגדלים לשחקים. שלום סלام عليكم احنا فرحين ونحبكم نمنا بكانون وبحليل ولد اسماعيل وإسرائيل. מלאל והאוניות בין גל לגל שימו רזנים ובני מלכים הנה מה טוב שבט אחים כל עוד יזרח בינינו אור נחיה יחדיו מדור לדור. שלום סלام عليكم احنا فرحين ونحبكم نمنا بكانون وبحليل ولد اسماعيل وإسرائيل. שלום סלام عليكم احنا فرحين ونحبكم احنا بكانون وبحليل ولد اسماعيل وإسرائيل. انتم بوابة الشام للهند لسين بيدان جدان الطيرات قلبان تحلقوا على سفان تبحر في البحار.